In the winter of 2023, nestled within the historic lanes of Charleston, South Carolina, resided the Walkers, a family envied by their picturesque neighbors. Emily Walker, a poised 38-year-old woman with a penchant for hosting flawless dinners, lived with her husband Thomas, a charismatic 42-year-old architect known for his charm and humor. Together, they embodied the image of wedded bliss. Their daughter, Lila, a vibrant 19-year-old with a love for literature, had recently returned from her first semester at university for the winter break. The Walker family was the neighborhood's hallmark of stability and warmth. Emily's friends often sought her advice on how to nurture a marriage, citing the effortless partnership she shared with Thomas. Every Sunday, the couple could be seen taking their morning stroll, hand in hand, discussing everything from mundane grocery lists to the latest trends in architecture. Lila, meanwhile, was the pride of her parents and the darling of the neighborhood, a bright, witty girl who had inherited her father's humor and her mother's sharp intellect. Lila's homecoming was a momentous occasion. Emily had spent days preparing for her daughter's return, rearranging furniture, stringing twinkling lights along the banister, and even baking Lila's favorite lemon drizzle cake. Thomas, ever the doting father, had painted Lila's old bookshelf a fresh shade of teal, her favorite color. Together, they turned their modest, picturesque house into a warm cocoon, eagerly awaiting the sound of her laughter filling their home once again. On January 10th, the Walkers held a small gathering to celebrate Lila's return. The living room bustled with family friends, laughter, and clinking glasses. Thomas, as always, played the gracious host, ensuring every guest felt welcome. Lila entertained the guests with stories from her university life, while Emily basked in the glow of her family's happiness. Yet, as she watched her husband and daughter interact, a faint whisper of discomfort crept into her mind. It was subtle. A lingering glance here, a shared smile there. Thomas and Lila had always been close, but tonight their dynamic seemed different, more intimate than Emily remembered. She dismissed the thought as a result of her exhaustion after hosting such a large event, and still a tiny seed of unease had been planted. Over the weeks that followed, life seemed to settle into its usual rhythm. Emily returned to her routines of running the household and managing her thriving gardening blog, while Thomas resumed work on a major architectural project in the city. Lila spent her days reading by the fireplace or catching up with old friends in town. To anyone on the outside, the Walkers seemed as happy as ever. But Emily couldn't shake the peculiar feeling that something was amiss. It began with small, almost imperceptible changes. Thomas and Lila spent more time together, long walks in the park, late-night chats in the living room. Emily didn't mind their closeness. After all, Thomas had always adored Lila. Yet she began to notice that their conversations would abruptly halt when she entered the room, replaced by awkward smiles and forced laughter. One night in late January, Emily woke up to find Thomas's side of the bed empty. Assuming he was working late in his study, she went downstairs to check. The light in Lila's room was on, and soft murmurs filtered through the door. Emily hesitated, feeling an unfamiliar tightness in her chest. She knocked lightly, and the voices inside stopped abruptly. Thomas opened the door, his expression startled but composed. "Lila couldn't sleep," he explained with a reassuring smile. "I was just keeping her company." Emily nodded, her suspicions subdued, but not silenced. She returned to bed, telling herself that she was overthinking. Yet, the memory of that night lingered in her mind like a shadow. By February, Emily's unease had grown. The small, strange details that had once seemed insignificant now began to take on greater meaning. Thomas and Lila's walks stretched longer, their shared jokes grew more private, and their glances carried an intensity that unsettled Emily. The moments when she caught them whispering to each other, stopping abruptly when she appeared, began to feel less like coincidence and more like concealment. Emily, desperate for clarity, started paying closer attention. She noticed how Lila's demeanor shifted around Thomas, her laughter softer, her smiles tinged with something Emily couldn't quite place. Thomas, too, seemed different, his usual affectionate nature now feeling calculated and deliberate. One particularly cold evening in early February, Emily walked into the living room to find Thomas and Lila sitting unusually close on the couch, their heads bent over Lila's phone. They didn't notice her at first, engrossed in whatever they were sharing. When Emily cleared her throat, they both jumped slightly, their expressions shifting into forced cheerfulness. "Hey, Emily," Thomas said, his voice a little too bright. "We were just looking at some photos Lila took at college." Emily smiled, but her heart felt heavy. She nodded and retreated to the kitchen, the unsettling feeling now impossible to ignore. Her mind raced with questions she didn't dare to voice, but one thought stood out above all others. Something was changing within her family, and she was no longer a part of it. On February 15th, Emily returned home unexpectedly early from a meeting. As she stepped inside, the quiet house felt eerily still. She called out for Thomas and Lila, but there was no response. Wandering into the living room, she spotted a notebook lying on the coffee table, partially hidden under a pile of magazines. Curiosity piqued, Emily picked it up and flipped through its pages. It was Lila's handwriting. Sketches of poetry, snippets of thoughts, and diary-like entries. But one entry stopped Emily cold. "Some connections are too strong to deny. He sees me, truly sees me, in a way no one else ever has. It feels wrong, but it also feels right."
Emily's hands shook as she read the words. A chill ran down her spine, and her vision blurred with tears. She closed the notebook and placed it back on the table, her mind racing with possibilities. What had she just stumbled upon? What was happening between her husband and her daughter? In that moment, Emily knew that her perfect family was crumbling, and the life she had built was slipping through her fingers. She didn't have the answers yet, but one thing was certain: she needed to uncover the truth, no matter how painful it might be. The discovery of Lila's diary entry haunted Emily, unraveling her composure piece by piece. Though her outward demeanor remained calm, her mind churned with questions. She began replaying every moment, every conversation, every glance between her husband and daughter. The doubt she had suppressed for weeks now consumed her thoughts, turning every interaction into a puzzle begging to be solved. Emily knew she couldn't confront them yet, not without more evidence, not without fully understanding what was happening under her roof. Instead, she decided to watch and wait, gathering whatever she could to piece together the truth. The uncertainty was unbearable, but Emily knew that rushing into a confrontation might only push the truth further out of reach. On February 18th, Emily decided to conduct her first real investigation. She waited until Thomas and Lila left for an afternoon outing, then entered Lila's room under the guise of cleaning. It wasn't something she had done since Lila was a child, respecting her daughter's privacy. But now, Emily felt no such restraint. She needed answers. The room was tidy, with Lila's books and trinkets arranged neatly on shelves. Emily's eyes scanned every surface before landing on Lila's bedside drawer. Inside, she found the usual assortment of items: a phone charger, lip balm, a journal. The journal caught her attention immediately. Unlike the notebook she had seen on the coffee table, this one was locked with a small clasp. Emily's heart raced as she held it, but without a way to open it, she was forced to put it back. As she stepped away from the drawer, something under the bed caught her eye. It was a small box, its lid slightly ajar. Inside were folded pieces of paper, and Emily's breath hitched as she unfolded one. It was a letter, handwritten in Thomas's unmistakable script. "Lila, I've never felt this way before. You've awakened something in me that I can't explain. I know this is dangerous, but I can't seem to stay away." Emily's knees nearly buckled as she read the words. A sickening wave of nausea swept over her, but she forced herself to keep reading. There were several more letters, all filled with the same inappropriate confessions, the same tortured justifications for what was clearly an illicit and horrifying relationship. When Emily finally left Lila's room, she felt like a stranger in her own home. She couldn't look at Thomas or Lila the same way anymore. Every smile, every laugh between them now felt tainted. How could they sit at the dinner table, pretending everything was normal, when this was happening behind her back? Over the following week, Emily became more observant than ever. She noticed how Thomas always seemed to linger near Lila, how their conversations were filled with an intimacy that no longer felt fatherly. Emily also began to pick up on Lila's behavior, how her eyes lit up when Thomas spoke to her, how she leaned into him when they sat together on the couch. But Emily also noticed something else: guilt. Lila's demeanor around Emily had changed, becoming more hesitant and subdued. When Emily entered a room, Lila's eyes often darted away, and her voice grew quieter. Emily could sense the weight of unspoken truths hanging over them all, threatening to crack the carefully maintained facade of their family. On February 25, Emily's suspicions reached a breaking point. She had planned to meet a friend for coffee that afternoon, but an icy rainstorm canceled their plans. Returning home earlier than expected, Emily found the house eerily quiet. As she approached the living room, muffled voices reached her ears. She stopped just outside the doorway, her heart pounding. Peering in, Emily saw Thomas and Lila sitting on the couch, their heads close together. They weren't speaking anymore, just staring at each other in a way that made Emily's stomach turn. It wasn't the look of a father and daughter, it was something else entirely. Emily stepped into the room, feigning nonchalance. "What are you two up to?" she asked, forcing a smile. Thomas and Lila sprang apart, their faces flushing with guilt. "Nothing," Thomas said quickly. "We were just talking about her classes." Emily's smile didn't falter, but her voice grew sharper. "Talking about classes? You looked like you were sharing a secret." Lila stammered something unintelligible, and Thomas reached for the TV remote, changing the subject. Emily didn't press them further, but as she walked away, she felt the weight of their shared guilt pressing down on her. That night, Emily lay awake in bed, her mind racing with questions. What should she do? Who could she talk to? The idea of sharing this with anyone, her friends, her family, seemed impossible. How could she explain what was happening without shattering the lives of everyone involved? But the longer she stayed silent, the more complicit she felt in their betrayal. The following morning, Emily made a decision. She would confront Thomas. She couldn't go on pretending that everything was fine, not when the truth was poisoning her from the inside out. At breakfast, she waited for the right moment. When Lila excused herself to take a phone call, Emily turned to Thomas. "We need to talk," she said, her voice steady but firm. Thomas glanced at her, his expression wary. "About what?" Emily leaned forward, her eyes locking onto his. "About you and Lila." "Don't lie to me, Thomas. I know something is going on." For a moment, Thomas said nothing, his face pale. Then, he forced a laugh. "Emily, you're imagining things. Lila is our daughter. Whatever you're thinking, it's ridiculous." Emily didn't waver. "Don't insult my intelligence. I've seen the way you look at her. I've read the letters." At this, Thomas's composure shattered. His eyes widened, and his hands clenched the edge of the table. "What letters?" he asked, his voice trembling. Emily stared at him, her anger barely contained. "The ones you wrote to her. The ones I found in her room. Do you have any idea how disgusting this is? How much you've betrayed me?" Thomas opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. The sound of footsteps interrupted them as Lila returned, her expression cautious. "What's going on?" she asked, sensing the tension. Emily stood, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. "Why don't you tell her, Thomas? Or should I?" Thomas shot a panicked look at Lila, who froze, her face draining of color. The silence that followed was deafening, and Emily felt the weight of it settle over the room like a suffocating fog. As the confrontation loomed, Emily realized that her family was standing on the edge of a precipice. One wrong move, one careless word, and everything would come crashing down. But she couldn't stop now. She had to see this through, no matter how painful it might be. The air in the Walker household grew heavier in the days following Emily's confrontation. Though the confrontation at the breakfast table had ended in silence, its aftermath was palpable. Lila avoided Emily's gaze, retreating to her room or spending hours at the local library. Thomas tried to maintain a facade of normalcy, but the cracks in his composure betrayed his growing unease. Emily, on the other hand, was no longer content to be passive. The confrontation had only hardened her resolve. The truth had begun to surface, but she needed more evidence, more clarity, and most importantly, an answer to the burning question in her mind: why? Why would Thomas and Lila betray her in such an unthinkable way? On March 1st, Emily devised a plan. She began documenting everything: secretive glances, hushed conversations, moments when they grew silent at her approach. It was as though she had become an investigator in her own home, piecing together the puzzle of her shattered life. That evening, Emily found herself sitting in the darkness of her bedroom, Thomas's phone in her lap. She had taken it while he showered, knowing she had only a few minutes before he noticed its absence. Unlocking the phone with the code she had memorized weeks ago, she began scrolling through his messages. At first, there was nothing unusual: work emails, mundane exchanges with friends, reminders about upcoming appointments. But then, she stumbled upon a hidden folder in his photo gallery. With a deep breath, she opened it. What she found made her blood run cold. The folder contained photos of Lila, some innocent, taken during family outings, but others that felt deeply unsettling. There were candid shots of her in their home, reading on the couch, sleeping in her bed. Emily's hands trembled as she stared at the images, unable to comprehend how Thomas could do something so invasive, so wrong. She returned the phone just as Thomas emerged from the bathroom, his hair damp and a towel slung over his shoulders. He smiled at her, but Emily couldn't return it. Her stomach churned with anger and disgust as she realized the man she had loved for nearly 2 decades was a stranger to her. The next day, Emily decided to speak with Lila. She waited until Thomas had left for work and found Lila in the kitchen, sipping coffee and scrolling through her phone. Lila looked up, startled, as Emily entered the room. "Lila," Emily began, her voice calm but firm. "We need to talk." Lila hesitated, her fingers tightening around her coffee mug. "About what?" Emily sat across from her, folding her hands on the table. "About your father. About what's been happening between you two." Lila's face flushed, and her eyes darted away. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Don't lie to me," Emily said sharply. "I've seen the letters. I've seen the way you look at each other. I know something is going on." Tears welled in Lila's eyes, and for a moment, Emily thought she might deny it again. But then, Lila broke. Her shoulders shook as she buried her face in her hands, sobbing uncontrollably. Emily's heart ached, torn between anger and an overwhelming sense of betrayal. "It wasn't supposed to happen," Lila choked out between sobs. "I didn't mean for it to go this far." Emily felt the room spin around her. "How far, Lila? What did you do?" Lila hesitated, her sobs quieting as she wiped her face with trembling hands. "It started after I came home for winter break. Dad, he was always so understanding, so supportive. I felt so alone at college, and she broke off, unable to continue." Emily's stomach turned as the pieces fell into place. The emotional closeness she had once admired between Thomas and Lila had become something twisted and unnatural. Her hands clenched into fists as she fought to contain her rage. "You're my daughter," Emily said, her voice shaking. "How could you let this happen? How could you betray me like this?" Lila sobbed harder, unable to answer. Emily stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor. She couldn't bear to look at her daughter any longer. She stormed out of the kitchen, leaving Lila alone with her guilt and shame. Over the next few days, the tension in the house became unbearable. Emily couldn't look at Thomas without feeling a surge of anger and disgust, and her interactions with Lila were strained and cold. She began sleeping in the guest room, unable to share a bed with the man who had betrayed her in such a horrifying way. On March 7, Emily decided she couldn't stay silent any longer. She called her sister, Grace, and poured out the entire story. Grace listened in stunned silence, her disbelief turning to anger as Emily recounted everything she had discovered. "You need to leave, Emily," Grace said firmly. "Pack your things and get out of that house. You can stay with me as long as you need." But Emily wasn't ready to leave, not yet. She had spent years building this life, and she wasn't going to let Thomas and Lila destroy it without a fight. Instead, she began formulating a plan to expose their betrayal, to make them face the consequences of their actions. On the night of March 10, Emily gathered Thomas and Lila in the living room. She stood before them, her expression cold and determined. "I know everything," she said, her voice steady. "The letters, the photos, the lies. It's over." Thomas paled, his usual confidence crumbling. "Emily, please. Don't," she snapped, cutting him off. "I've spent weeks watching you two, piecing this together. You've both betrayed me in the worst way imaginable, and I won't let you get away with it." Lila began to cry, but Emily didn't waver. She had spent too long feeling powerless, too long allowing their lies to control her. Now, she was taking back that control. "You're going to pack your things," Emily continued, her voice ice cold. "Both of you. And you're going to leave this house by the end of the week. If you don't, I'll make sure everyone knows what you've done." Thomas stared at her, his face pale and stricken. "Emily, we can fix this." "There's nothing to fix," she said. You've destroyed this family. Now, it's time for you to face the consequences. As she left the room, Emily felt a sense of grim satisfaction. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew one thing: she would no longer be a victim. Thomas and Lila had underestimated her, but they would soon learn that she was stronger than they had ever realized. The days following Emily's ultimatum were a whirlwind of tension and dread. Thomas and Lila moved around the house like ghosts, their once cozy routines now shattered. Boxes began to pile up in the hallway as they prepared to leave, but the atmosphere was thick with unspoken words and unresolved emotions. For Emily, it was a bitter victory. She had won her home back, but at a cost so steep it felt like ashes in her hands. On March 13th, Thomas made one last attempt to salvage the wreckage of their lives. He approached Emily in the kitchen, his face drawn with exhaustion. "Emily," he began, his voice quiet. "I know I've hurt you. I know I've ruined everything, but please, don't do this. We can work through this. I'll get help. We can go to counseling." Emily didn't look up from the counter where she was slicing vegetables for dinner. Her hands moved with mechanical precision, the knife tapping rhythmically against the cutting board. "It's too late for that, Thomas," she said coldly. "You and Lila crossed a line that can never be uncrossed. There's no coming back from this." Thomas sighed, leaning heavily against the counter. "I made a mistake." "No," Emily snapped, finally meeting his gaze. Her eyes burned with fury. "A mistake is forgetting an anniversary or saying something hurtful in the heat of the moment. What you did wasn't a mistake, Thomas. It was a choice. A disgusting, selfish choice that destroyed this family." Thomas opened his mouth to respond, but the sound of the front door opening interrupted him. Lila walked in, her face pale and tired. She glanced between her parents, sensing the tension, and quickly excused herself to her room. The moment she was gone, Emily turned back to Thomas. "You'll leave by Friday," she said, her voice firm. "And if you think for 1 second I won't expose you, think again. I have the letters, the photos, the texts. You won't be able to charm your way out of this." Thomas's shoulders slumped in defeat. He knew there was no reasoning with her. Without another word, he left the kitchen, leaving Emily alone with the weight of her anger and grief. The night of March 17th arrived, the deadline Emily had given Thomas and Lila to leave. The house was eerily quiet, save for the sound of rain tapping against the windows. Emily sat in the living room, staring at the clock. It was almost midnight, and neither Thomas nor Lila had made any effort to leave. Her heart pounded with a mixture of rage and anxiety as she stood and made her way upstairs. She knocked on Lila's door first, but there was no answer. Turning the knob, she found the room empty, the bed neatly made. Panic began to creep in as she crossed the hall to Thomas's study. The door was locked. "Thomas," she called, her voice sharp. When there was no response, she banged on the door. "Thomas, open the door." Still, there was only silence. Emily's heart raced as she ran back downstairs to retrieve a spare key. Returning to the study, she unlocked the door and pushed it open. The sight before her stopped her cold. Thomas sat slumped at his desk, a bottle of whiskey in one hand and a piece of paper in the other. His eyes were closed, his face pale. An empty pill bottle lay on the desk beside him. "Thomas!" Emily screamed, rushing to his side. She shook him, her hands trembling, but he didn't respond. Her eyes darted to the note clutched in his hand, and with shaking fingers, she pried it free. The letter was short, written in Thomas's familiar scrawl. "Emily. I can't live with what I've done. I've hurt you, hurt Lila, and destroyed the life we built together. I'm sorry for everything. Please take care of her. She needs you now more than ever." Emily's vision blurred with tears as the weight of his words settled over her. She called 911, her hands shaking as she relayed the situation. The paramedics arrived quickly, but it was too late. Thomas was gone. The weeks following Thomas's death were a blur of grief, anger, and confusion. Emily and Lila barely spoke, their once close bond shattered beyond repair. Emily struggled to process her emotions. She hated Thomas for what he had done, but she couldn't deny the ache of losing the man she had once loved. Lila, too, was consumed by guilt and grief. She moved out of the house shortly after the funeral, retreating to the university campus to escape the weight of her mother's gaze. Emily didn't stop her. She knew they both needed time and space to heal, though she wasn't sure if healing was even possible. Months passed, and the house grew quieter. Emily found herself wandering its empty rooms, haunted by memories of the family she had once cherished. She poured her energy into her gardening blog, using it as an outlet for the pain she couldn't put into words. But no matter how much time passed, the scars of betrayal remained. One evening in late summer, Emily received a letter in the mail. It was from Lyla. Her hands trembled as she opened the envelope, unfolding the handwritten note inside. "Mom, I don't know if you'll ever forgive me, but I need you to know how sorry I am. I made a terrible mistake, and I'll regret it for the rest of my life. Dad's gone, and it's my fault. I know that. But I also know that I can't move forward without making things right with you. If you're willing, I'd like to meet and talk. Please let me know. Love. Lila." Emily stared at the letter for a long time, her emotions swirling. She didn't know if she could forgive Lila, or if she even wanted to. But as she sat in the quiet of her home, she realized that forgiveness wasn't just for Lila. It was for herself. To let go of the anger that had consumed her, to find peace in the aftermath of destruction. With a deep breath, Emily reached for a pen and began to write her reply.